Everyone, welcome to the very first of the workshops for Codebreak 2017 in the summer. Not to imply that we won't have a winter one. We are going to start off the workshop series with Fedor Paretsky. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. We're going to start off with Fedor Paretsky doing a workshop on Android development for beginners. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Fedor.
You're good. Hey everyone, so as Tyler said, I'm going to be going over like the basics, the very basics of Android development. So I'll be like pushing you through or teaching how to kind of like read the basic XML, which is basically the front end or what you see on your screen. So XML code. We'll go over that a bit later. And then kind of building a screen, so we'll be going over the technicalities of building actual views that you see on your Android like device or whatever. And then we'll go over some of the backends, so activities, lifecycle intents. You'll get to know all of those in detail. And then we'll close off the workshop with some basically like, developing an Android application from beginning to end. If we have some time left over, we'll do some extra stuff with that. So at the beginning, the file system, I'd say like when I was learning Android for the first time, the whole file system and all the different files and like the fact that there were like maybe like 50 different folders in the entire file system. If you were to like create a project that initializes like 50 different files, that was all very confusing to me. But you should know basically two things, that the backend and everything to do with like actual movement and changing things, it's all written in Java. So if you're familiar and like proficient in Java, you should be fine doing everything that has to do with that. And then there's XML, like I said earlier, it's for the front end and actually like creating the views. So whatever you see on the screen, it's built in XML. So it's not like learning an entire new language. I'd say it's almost like HTTP or HTML. So if you're familiar with HTML, XML shouldn't be that different. In fact, they share two letters. I just noticed that. And then the manifest is also written in XML, and that's just basically like giving the very basics of your application to the compiler to like read and understand when they build the APK, which is installed onto your phone. So things like that. Permissions, so like what you allow the application to use, so like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, maybe like writing to storage, like things like that, the application name, and then all the different activities, so like fairly general stuff. So now on to layouts and XML in detail. So these are just example screens, and they're all written in XML. No matter, like, they might look complex, but they're surprisingly all just written without even a touch of Java. And like I said, it's not that hard, but you see how complex these things can get. The very grounds, like the very basics of XML are like the very ground of XML is very basic, but it can, like, you can build up and up and up and create like complex views like this. And you might even notice some like similarities between like these two totally different applications, like the fact that all the information is stored in like these rows and that there's maybe like multiple tabs and that there's like this bar at the top. That's because like a lot of applications in Android share like design in XML. So like the default application that's built in Android Studio, the development environment that you use for Android, it looks pretty similar to all of these, and that's something you get without even doing coding. That's something you get at the very start when you actually just create a new project in Android. And so if we like go back, there's what I call 3 levels of a view in Android, or what you see on your screen. There's the actual activity, which is basically everything that's on your screen. An activity is just what you see at one time all together. And then there's containers, which we call view groups or layouts, and there's a couple of different types of view groups. So a container might be something that's stored here, something that's right here, just basically anything that stores more of something else. And a very, very important thing to understand is that there can be only one container for the entire screen, but there can be multiple containers within that container. I'll call them containers for now, but they're kind of interchangeable with views and view groups. View groups are just types of layouts. And so layouts, you'll understand, I'll go over that later, but there's a couple different types of layouts. And then within those layouts, at the very, very base of the XML and the layouts, you see things like buttons, texts, inputs like images. So where are some buttons? Like these are a bunch of buttons, or they're not buttons, they're menu items, but you can describe them as buttons because you click them, I guess. This is a text view, and this is like an image, and these are images, and this is a menu. Those are all examples of views. So, and they're all arranged by the view group, which we'll go over later. Different types of view groups arrange different, or arrange views differently by default. So there's a couple different view groups that you can use. So like I said earlier, activities are just the point of interaction for a user. One screen is always one activity. Just because Android is designed that way, you can't do something else. And it typically fills the whole screen, but it can also like float, it can fill a partition. So if you see something like a dialog box that pops up, that can be a view of its own. But it's basically one point of interaction with a user. So this is, I literally stole this from the Android development documentation. That's like the one that people use for Java. There's one for Android that's separate, and it defines an activity as being a entry point for an app's interaction with the user, providing the window in which the app draws its UI. So basically, a window is whatever's shown on the screen, like the window that's shown on the screen. The activity provides. Is basically what provides the basic interaction for a user with the application's UI. Typically fills the screen, but like I said, it can be smaller than the screen and float. And you implement activities and subclasses, like they're referencing Java by saying that, but we'll go over that in detail. So on to containers. So if we go back, containers, like I said earlier, is view groups or layouts. They're basically things that organize the views. Great, thanks. And they are called children in a way. So if you kind of know the reference of like parent-children relationships, view groups and views are parents and children. So they're formed in this hierarchy in a way, and you'll see what I mean by that later also in the application that we're going to develop. Here's a pretty good drawing that kind of summarizes everything that I said. So view groups can hold other view groups, but if this were a whole class, so if we say this is like an activity right here, and an activity, like I said earlier, can only have one main view group, but it contains views and other view groups which contain views, but view groups are always going to contain views. And here are some examples of views like edit text, button, text view, checkbox, spinner, progress bar, seek bar, on a bunch of other things. I don't know if this is the same example as earlier, but here's like a bunch of real life views in an actual application. I think this is Gmail literally, but you see that this is like the app bar, and you'll probably see at a certain point if you're developing some type of Android application, it'll probably have an app bar because that's a pretty common design feature when it comes to Android development. But things like the buttons, the text views, image views, other buttons, menus, and more buttons down here. And here's some categorized examples. So like a bunch of menus. So this is a menu. These like, I don't know if this is actually a menu. I think this is actually a spinner, so that's not a menu. However, it might be if it's a different like implementation of that. But these are a bunch of image buttons and image views. Image button is basically an image view that is a button. So like this is a button, but it has an image inside it. Buttons can be of all different shapes, forms, and sizes. They might not, like this is the default button, but if you like do a bunch of customization, it might not look like a button at all. And here are a bunch of text views, and I think we'll be using buttons and text views today in the last example that we're going to be using. So say I wanted to customize like a button. We would we call those attributes in XML. So like customizations that you can make to any view that you have in your application. So things like a view group can actually have customizations too. Like if you were if you had like a view group and you wanted to set like a background for the whole view group, not just all of the views, but all of the whole view group, you could create like a background color thing for it. But say like we wanted to change the size of like this text view. We could, I don't know if it's listed here, but we could change the size of the text view. In fact, we're gonna do that today too. And assign things like IDs. So if we want to manipulate what the view group has on the front end from the back end, so from the Java, we would assign IDs, and I don't mention it here, but we can assign IDs to actual views and then reference them from the Java code. And I guess you can think of this as CSS in a way, because like CSS, it goes into the HTML and alters all the, like you can alter things like text size, color, background color, all of these like font style or whatever. You can think of that kind of like being similar. And so like I mentioned resources, they're called resources, but I like to call them IDs usually. And you assign IDs to view groups there. I guess I really haven't inserted like an actual piece of code yet, but you'll see those later too. But yeah, they're kind of like constants in a way, but you they're like variable names. Like think variable names. I don't know why I haven't said that yet, but that's probably the best thought that you can put to it. They're variable names that you can reference from the Java code. Yeah, so now onto the actual Java code. So from the Java point of view, activity is also like one thing that's happening on a screen at one time. So it's basically one screen that's focused. And it has a life cycle. So think of a life cycle like being a bunch of default methods that you have in a piece of Java code. And each of them are called whenever the user does something that's like not in your app, but like is like in the actual Android system. So like if I took out my phone and I opened the app, like I clicked on the app and opened up, it would call the onCreate method in my activities class. If I closed it, or if I clicked like the little app drawer and I or pressed the home button while the app was still running, it would call on pause and things like that. So here's a bunch of methods. So if you see like new activity when it starts to run, or when I open the app and an activity starts to run, the onCreate, onStart, and onResume methods are called. I'm not sure if all of these are called, but I know that the onCreate is definitely called. And so if you press the home button while your app is running, the onPause method is called and the activity is paused. If you swipe and, or I think if you actually go to the home screen or start a different application, it's fully stopped. And if you remove it from your app drawer, like the recent apps, it's destroyed. So the onDestroy method is called. And so the reason for having these methods in the first place is I think you're required to have the onCreate method when you're implementing the activities class in Java, but the rest of these methods are optional. So if you have an application that's using a ton of memory, like it's doing these network requests all the time, the point of these methods is for you to, as a developer, realize that I lost my train of thought, but when this method is called, you should probably stop making the network request because the user no longer sees your app. But on the other hand, if you're an app like Gmail and you create like push notifications to the user whenever a new email arrives, maybe you shouldn't pause the network like activity or whatever you're doing with the network. Maybe you should realize, oh, the user exited the app. Maybe I should start pushing notifications now into the system rather than within the app. And so like I like to always like end with this analogy. Think of multiple activities as a stack of papers. So if I guess we're going to go on right now to actual intents or having multiple activities running within an app. But if you were to call another activity or start another activity, it would form like into a stack. So like these stacks of papers would continuously stack on top of each other. I'll use like a napkin. But you have like this is another activity, this is the activity that's running, then you have another activity. And so if I destroy this activity, the snapcan rips apart and goes away, and you have like the old activity that's running. So you can have only one that's why you can only have one activity running at a time. What else did I think I touched up on everything that I had to say. Yeah, if you remove like the last activity that's running, there's nothing left for the activity to run, and so the app exists. Now onto intents, or basically starting extra activities. So like an example of an intent or activity with multiple classes would be maybe you have a login screen, and you log in, so you do, or like a registration screen, you enter in all your info and you press the register button, and once the user presses the register button, if everything looks correct, like if you have some if statement somewhere that tests whether the first name actually doesn't contain any numbers or anything like that, or the email is valid, you'll create an intent and start the intent using a special method to start the other activity. So maybe you want to push the person to whatever the main activity happens to be. And so you create an intent to start that activity and close the previous activity down using a separate method. So it's actually the start activity method right here. But what's cool is that you can create like things like called content providers, which we're not going to go into detail for. But it's basically saying that there's a certain protocol to all the applications that are on your phone. So if you can use the same intents to pass some data into Google Maps and or the browser, along with like the URL or the address that you're navigating to for Google Maps in the web browser, and call the exactly same method, and it will do everything perfectly. Like it's something that takes 30 seconds to learn, and it's something that's really powerful because you can basically use cool things like Google Maps and web browsers without implementing your own maps inside like an app. And context, like these methods, they require you to pass in the context of your activity, and it's basically like a snippet of information for your application, so that origin activity can pass the receiving activity a bunch of information about like what's running in the app, what the previous activity was, things like that. But it's nothing. It's literally, if you're implementing like an activity class, you can literally pass in this, like the this keyword, and you don't have to do any crazy manipulation to do that. So now we're going to go on to FizzBus. So we're going to create a application that lets you kind of scroll through a number, so go like 0 to 100, and if the number that's shown on the screen is divisible by, what is it, like 5, prints fizz, and then 3 it's buzz.
3 and 5.
Oh, so it's the opposite. 3, if the number is divisible by 3 without any remainder, so mod 3 equals 0, you print fizz, and if it's mod 5, you print buzz, and for the other ones you don't print anything. So I'm not going to go into detail about how to install Android Studio. It's pretty straightforward. You just download it and you install it, and I don't think they even ask you any ridiculous questions. It's like, what API level do you want to use? And I'll go into detail about what API levels are and everything. But at the end, when you install everything correctly, hopefully everything goes correctly, you should open up Android Studio and see this dialog box. I won't go into detail about how to install an emulator, but this is basically emulating an Android phone, because silly me, I have an iOS device even though I don't do any iOS development. And everything that I run from Android Studio should be visible on this emulator. So once you see the screen, just click Start a New Android Studio Project, because that's what we want to do. And so we'll give this application a name, and the name's going to be, let's just call it FizzBus, and a company domain. So if you're working for some company, this is basically Android's identifier for an application. So if you go into settings and go into like the details for every application, you'll see a piece of text that's going to be like this. So if I'm saying, like, if I own the website fedora.com, which I wish I did, it'd be com.fedora.fizzbus, and that's like a way of Android like differentiating among applications. So if Google is making a bunch of applications, and we'd call this like maps or something, be com.google.maps. But we're doing FizzBuzz, so FizzBuzz and Fedor.com. And we don't need C++ support. I've never used that. And project location should be somewhere that's accessible for you. So now onto API levels. So we're developing for a phone and tablet, because that's clearly what we have right here. And there's a bunch of API levels. So I have the SDKs, or the software development kits, for API level 19 and 21. And if you look closely, you'll see that these are just Android versions, basically. And so what minimum SDK means is you're establishing an API level that your application should run on at a minimum. So let's say our app wants to use something like the camera. If our app uses something like a camera, there has to be software within Android that supports the camera. And maybe that was introduced at API level 4, but there wasn't such a thing at API level 1. That means that we have to target, or we have to have a minimum SDK of at least API level 4 for the users to install our app. Otherwise our app might crash, or it will just not have support at all. It's relevant whether the user has a phone on their camera, but we try to use some library on Android that is for the camera. It won't be accessible to people that are under API level 4. So basically what this percentage right here means that you want to pick a API level that's low, because the lower the API level, the more people will likely have an API level that is at least that high. So if we pick something like API level 9, everybody's going to have an API level that's greater than 9, because it's like taking XP users. Like almost everybody has Windows 7 right now. So that means that everybody's has at least some system that supports everything that XP probably supported, right? So that's why API level 9 will run on approximately 100% of devices. But if you take something like API 26, that's like saying my application will only run on Windows 15. Nobody has Windows 15, at least not that I know. So you want to target something like API level 9, which is basically the Windows, I guess you could say it's the Windows 7 of Android. I like to target API level 9 because it's the most the most like default to a lot of Android development. A lot of like big applications, I think, default to or use a minimum SDK of API level 19. I don't know, I might have said 9 before, but I meant 19. So yeah, 74% of devices, and that's like taking all of Android, all of the Android devices in the whole world. 74% of them will be 74% of the people that use Android or have an Android phone will be able to use this application. Okay, so let's move on. Now we pick a basic framework for the start of our like application. So these are basically templates for what we're going to be building. Since I usually pick empty activity because it doesn't add all this extra unnecessary code, and it's kind of like a very good place to start. At least you can try basic activity and it'll have like this button that you can like program to do something, but I don't need that button, so I'm just going to use the empty activity as a start. And we give that activity a name, a layout name, which is just a name for the XML file, and a activity name, which is like the name like for the Java file. So this would be main activity.java, and this would be activity_main.xml. Usually the main activity is called main activity, so I'll just keep this the same. And backwards compatibility, that's a little bit hard to explain, but you're free to look that up, of course. I'll move this over so we can see everything at once. So, all right. I try to always start with actually I'll explain this first. So this is what you'll see like when you complete like the whole setup that I just went through. you'll see this file explorer on the left, this code thing, like coding text editor on the right, and you'll see a bunch of buttons. I don't even worry about what any of these buttons mean. In fact, I probably never used any of these. I only worry about this button, which is the run button. This is button, that's the debug button. I don't even know what that is. The launch AVD button, which basically launches this emulator, gives you a menu to launch this emulator from. And the SDK manager button, which allows you to install different SDKs or different API levels. So if you wanted to install like a special library for hardware accelerated like processing of something, like it'd probably be in there. If you don't see something like this, make sure this is set to project, this button's project right here, and that this Gradle thing is not like hovering over the whole thing. And if you don't see this file structure right here, make sure this is basically like different ways to view the same file structure. Make sure this is set to Android because that's the most easy to read file structure hierarchy. So I'll go over this. This is the folder or the package that contains all of the Java code. So this is the test library, which you don't really need to know. All you need to know is that the main activity is right here. And if I close this, here's the main activity. And then res, it's the resources. So like resources for like layouts, drawables is like images, mipmap is like the icon. But like you see, like if we launch the app right now, or if you look at like a lot of things here, like all of these have this as the icon because that's the default icon for development for Android. And then these are things like strings, styles, colors. We'll go over that a little bit later if we have time. But you should know for sure that the activity main XML or the main activity layout file is right here. So I like to start with all development with layouts, and I like doing the front end first before we do any of the back ends, because usually when you're developing something, you like to see what it looks like first before you like work on behavior. Yeah, I can't think of a good analogy for that, but I just like to work on layouts before anything else. So I deleted that. This was a text view that was like hello world. So if like we run this right now, yeah, so whenever you want to run some things, press on the play button and then use same selection for future launches. You're selecting a device to use, and I want to use the Nexus 5X that's running right here. It's an emulator. So I don't have to click on this all the time and just say use same selection. So it builds the Gradle. I won't go into details about the Gradle either, but it's basically keeps track of a bunch of things that are included in your project, like things like different libraries that you might want to use. So if you're doing like network stuff, you might have to import like a network library, but it keeps track of like a bunch of groundwork, like compiler information in here, like our minimum SDK versions right here, by the way, and like the version code, the version name, the compiler version that we're using, things like that. What sucked is before Android Studio, you had to actually like do this all in the command line. Now, thankfully, you can just click the play button and you don't have to know anything that's going on, although it would probably help to know what's going on in the background. But there's our hello world text view right there. That's just so I can show you guys what this looks like. Actually, I'll even do this. This is better. We're going to show a preview, and I'm going to do this so we can see exactly what we're seeing. So let's start with the layout now. First of all, we're going to change this to a relative layout. Scratch that. We're going to use a linear layout. Difference between a relative layout and a linear layout. If you think about a linear layout, it's linear, so everything is usually spaced evenly, and it's not like side to side. It's like in one direction, like a linear like a linear line, literally like on a graph is something that's straight and goes in one direction. So we're going to use a linear layout just because it's better for what we're trying to do. I don't have a draw out for what our view is going to look like, but it's going to be a text view in the center, and then a minus and plus button to increment and subtract the button that we have, and then a reset and random button to the bottom left and the bottom right to reset the button to 0, and then a random to create a random number, and then a text view at the very bottom that says fizz or buzz or nothing. So let's make this a linear layout, and we're gonna start with a bunch of buttons. So we're gonna type in a opening caret, I think that's what it's called, and then just press enter. And it's going to give us the layout width and the layout height, and the difference between wrap content and match parent is wrap content wraps whatever you're putting inside the button. So instead of making the button huge, you'll just wrap it around, make the size whatever the size of the text that occupies the button is. And we're going to make it have the text minus equals minus, and we're gonna give it an ID of @ plus ID button subtracts, and then we're gonna give it add another button that's the same thing except it's for adding. So we go over here, we're gonna change this to add or plus, and then we're gonna change this to add, and then we're gonna stick a text view in the middle, just because the text view is in between the two things, and it's going to have a layout width. I don't know why this is like that. Layout width. Whoops. Layout width of wrap content. Layout height. Wrap content. And then it's going to have a default text of 0, because that's what our default text is going to be. We're going to start at 0. We're going to increase the size a bit, and SP is just the unit of measurement. I forgot what it's called. Somebody might be able to correct me in the chat if we have one even. And then we're going to give this an ID of TV number, so text view and then number. And we can remove this and do this. So you'll see that this is kind of like positioned weirdly. I want it to be like in the center of the screen. So the best way to do that is just wrap this in another linear layout, which is going to be also wrap content and wrap contents. Just because we're going to have a bunch of rows of things that are arranged horizontally. So our linear layout at the top is going to arrange its children like in rows that go vertically, and we can set our linear layouts that are the children to wrap its children, the actual views like the button text view, horizontally. So like think of like a bunch of rows, and then each row has a bunch of columns. That's that. And I forgot to, basically by default, I think the linear layouts are horizontal, so we gotta set this to vertical. So now we're gonna add or reset buttons and all of that. So we're gonna have another linear layout just because it's another row with a bunch of buttons as columns or whatever. And we're gonna also do wrap content and wrap content. And this is gonna have two buttons like I said earlier, reset and random. And let's do the reset button first. It's going to be on the left. So we're going to give it a ID of @+ID button reset. We're going to give it text reset. And then make another button. So wrap content. And it's going to have Android ID @+ID button random and Android text. And then at the very bottom, we're going to have just a text view. And it's also going to be wrap content. As you can see, I'm like doing wrap content like all the time. It's basically a habit, but I very rarely use match parent, just because match parent literally wraps the entire view to be the entire screen. So if you had like a single button and you did match parent and its parent was this linear layout, it would wrap the whole screen in that single button, which would be obviously like a very weird thing to see, and nobody wants to really use an app that's weird. And we're gonna give this text view at the very bottom just a thing called TV message, text view message. So we're gonna give this some text, placeholder text right now, just test, so we can see what it looks like. So this is grayed out because we don't need it. So as you can see right now, it's like all weird. It's like all on, like in the left, it's on the left side, but I want it to be in the middle. So how do we do that? We give the entire view a gravity of center. So that's what's saying. It's basically saying like center all of this stuff in the center of the screen and at the center of the screen, both horizontally and vertically. So if now we see that it's all like clustered together, and I want to separate it. I want to have this whole set of buttons at the top of the screen and then the message at the bottom of the screen, so it's I guess just less clustered, easier to read. So what we do here is we assign each item a weight, and what it does is basically says it's kind of like giving it like a certain priority to each child or whatever. Priority to be at the top of the screen or at the bottom of the screen. It's basically like saying this view or whatever, it can occupy only so much of the screen. So if you get like 0.9, if you separate two views to be 0.9 and 0.1, the 0.1 will have a weight of 1/10, so it'll occupy, I think, 1/10 of the screen. I think that's how it works. It's not too complicated. I just never went really into depth learning it. I'll also give you like one piece of advice right now. A lot of this is trial and error. I wouldn't go around and like drag these around and see if it like works. If like dragging around and getting it to be placed efficiently would work. I would literally go into the code and see like to add different attributes that do different things to make it just work in the ends. So what I'm going to do is assign this a layout weight of 0.9, and what it just did is it gave this whole thing right here a weight of 0.9. If we wanted to add padding, I guess we could go into padding top and do, I think it's in pixels. So we can do something like that. If we go run this app right now, I'm going to stop this. That's the stop button, clearly denoted. There you go. So what we see right here, this is basically Android's interpreter. It interprets I don't know if interpreter is the right technical word, but it interprets the XML and then just views whatever it would, however it would put this into an actual view. It interprets it and just draws it out right here. And what's cool is you can like click around and it will like push you down to the proper like XML child or view or whatever. But yeah, that's basically it. So now that we have the view working, we have about 17 minutes left, and I'll work on the basic functionality. And I'm gonna kick up the pace a little bit because this should be more familiar for all of you. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make this public. Here's our onCreate method.
Can you make your text a little bigger, by the way? I think just Command plus. Or Command scroll or something.
Maybe Command scroll.
Otherwise, it's like view, and there should be something in there.
View. I think I can do presentation mode.
Yeah, cool.
All right, so we're gonna have to exit this presentation mode at a certain point, but we're gonna create these make these public because the method that's not on create will be accessing them, and I don't want to go through the hassle of constantly pushing these out. So I'm gonna capture the views that we have in our layout by doing this. I'm gonna cast it as a text view and then call the find view by ID method and then go r.id.tv number, and then I'm gonna do the same thing for the buttons that we have. So add button, so the button with the plus has a button find view by ID, and then button add. Same thing for the subtract button. I wish I had this code already laid out. It would have been a lot easier to do. Subtract button reset. There's libraries that prevent you from doing this. So if you think this is boring, you should go and find a library that helps you deter this. I think it's called Butterknife. If you're familiar with libraries, you might already know that library. Oops, there should be a button.
So what you're doing right now is the r.id.button reset and et cetera, is all the IDs that you set up when you're creating those buttons in the last
So
time.
these are, if you look back at our...
I think it should be the other tab right there, right?
I'm not sure. I have to what's the exit full screen, exit presentation mode? I wish that was... If you go back here, all of these are basically the IDs that we set right here. So add plus ID, which is basically saying declare this as a new ID and then slash whatever ID I'm using right here. So if we go back into the, I have to go back and redo this again and go to main activity. God, Android, why don't you just use Command plus to increase the view or the text size? And then we're just going to use do the message text view. So go into the text view and TV message. And then, so all of these buttons have a on-click listener. But instead of attaching individual on-click listeners, if you're familiar with the Java Swing library, you know that you can to create new on-click listeners. But there's an easier way to do it. Instead of doing it separately, we're going to create a method that implements it. So we're going to say implements view.onClickListener, and this is specifically for buttons. And if we go and do Alt Option or the Option key on the Mac and then Alt Enter, you'll get this menu and click Enter and then click onClick. And so what it just did is it made us an onClick method. So we're going to attach on-click listeners to all of these buttons so we know that they're clicked, right? So set on-click listener this, subtract button dot set on-click listener this, reset button set on-click listener this, and random button dot set on-click listener this. Okay, so that's it. That's all that's done in the onCreate method. So that's all that's done to initialize the application. So now we're gonna go on to the onClick method and implement the actual behavior. That's all gonna be done here. So first because we're gonna be using the number that's right here, that user chooses, we're gonna be using that often, and it's a piece of string. You get it as a string. We're gonna have to keep parsing it, but I'm gonna avoid that and just parse it once at the very top of the application, at the very top of the method. So I call the current number text view, so that object right here for the text view, and I call the get string, or I call the get text. It's get text, and then it's given as a, if you look, it's given as a car sequence. So I'm just going to do .toString, and we're going to start our switch statement. So a switch statement has a parameter right here for what it's testing, what it's testing in the if, and it has a bunch of cases. So we're gonna first do the case for the add button. And so what I did here is gave me a view, and I took it and I got the ID, which is this. So every time I'm gonna do a case, I'm gonna literally reference the actual ID. So v.getID would match this ID. And if you print these out, if you go and print out what this is, it'll print you out a number, I think it's an abstract number or a long string of something, but it's like an identifier for that view in the layout. And we're gonna implement the behavior. So first, We don't want the user to go over 100, so I'm going to say that, like, go over 100 when they keep on adding things. So I'm going to say that should be current number. I'm going to say that if it's less than 100, we can go and take the current number text view and then set the text to be the current number plus 1 plus a string, like I forget what this is called, but we're basically declaring this integer to be a string by adding a string to it, because that's what Android automatically does. And then we're gonna go down here and break out of this method. So if we go, let's implement the behavior of the subtract button, and same thing. We don't want the user to be able to go under 0. So we're gonna go and say if current number is greater than 0, current number text view dot set text is equal to current number minus 1 plus the string thing, same thing. And then we're gonna break. And so now for the reset button, this is very easy. Or reset, button reset, yeah. Current number text view dot set text, we're just going to set it equal to 0, and we're going to set the message text view to be 0 just because 0, when 0 is printed out, FizzBuzz is blank, like we don't print out anything, so we're just going to reset the text view to also be equal to 0, and we're going to go break, and then we're going to do the random button. This is probably going to be the longest portion of the code, but it's all fairly simple. I'm just going to declare a new random object, and I'm going to do the same thing, alt option enter to automatically import it. If we go back up here, it's imported right there. And I'm just going to declare it as a new random object. Current number text view dot set text r dot next int. So this is basically just taking another number that's 0 through 100, adding, or 0 through 99. I'm going to add 1 to it, so it's 0 through 100, or 1 through 100 instead of 0 through 99, and then I'm going to add a empty string to it as before. So now that's it. So I'm going to do a break, and then the defaults, even though we shouldn't really need this. Now, whenever something happens, like whenever the text view is changed, we need to update the message. So I'm just going to call the update FizzBuzz code or method that I'm about to create, and I'm just going to say public void update FizzBuzz. We don't need a return method or parameters or return type or anything, because we're not returning or needing anything. So first we're going to want to set this to be blank just to reset it for all the edge cases that we might have. We're going to take the current number, again, like we did up here, and we're going to parse it. Oops, I think I deleted it. Okay. Int current number, parse, like same thing from up there. We're just converting the string into an integer. And then we're going to do a long if statement. So let's see how much, we have 7 minutes left. Plenty of time. We're almost done. So one long if statement, and then just actual logic for FizzBuzz. So if it's 3, current number mod 3 is equal to 0, we're gonna set the message text view to be fizz. And then else if current number is mod 5, we're going to set it equal to be buzz. And then else if current number, this is just going to be an Easter egg that I thought of yesterday. 13 is obviously nobody's lucky number, but I'm fairly unlucky, so I'm going to just say 13. And we're going to set it equal to be Fedor. I don't know the meaning behind fizz and buzz, and Tyler's laughing back there. But that's basically it. That's all of the logic. So if we go, and I'm going to exit this presentation mode that I really dislike. I'm gonna scroll over to here. So if you look at it now, this is our old application running. Nothing's going on because we didn't implement any of the behavior, and this is still test. And I'm actually gonna remove that because we don't want the default text to be test anymore. So I'm just gonna remove this from down here. And you can press the play button. If it has the little circle right there, it means that there's instant run running, which means that if your application's taking a long time to build and like go onto your device, instant run basically swaps changes in a way, and it does it like very quickly. So if there's that little green circle right there, it's just basically going to do instant run. If you were to stop it, it would probably reset the whole thing and have to rebuild the entire application from scratch, which would take really long, but I'm on a fairly fast machine, so it shouldn't take that long. So great, if we go and here and press plus, there's our working FizzBuzz. So if we go fizz, I don't know if you can hear, can they hear my computer text? No? Well, you can hear the little, or at least I can hear it, the little like clicking noises that your phone makes. But if we go 13, Fedor, and then if we click the random button, we get a bunch of different random numbers, and if we click the reset button, we get 0. If we try to go below 0, I'm not going to click all the way to 100, but if we try to go below 0, it's going to not be able to click through. All right, so that's that. Questions?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to point out you did not technically actually correctly implement FizzBuzz, in that if a number is evenly divisible by both 3 and 5, you're supposed to print FizzBuzz.
Oh, like both?
Yeah.
Oh, we can add that too.
Yeah, feel free to do that if you want to.
Tyler, so close.
You would have failed the interview. But did have another question. In the set onClick handler, you set onClick handler to this, which is a class. So can you explain why it is that you're setting the onClick handler to this, and why that causes it to run that specific one?
So since our class implements the onClick listener, we're basically saying that our activity object is implementing the onClick listener of the view class. And the onClick listener is a object, or I'd call it a behavior in a way, because it is like you click on something, it behaves in a certain way. It's something that's works with all views, so like you can do the same thing for texts. In fact, like I'm gonna go back. Yeah, you can implement onClick listeners for text. So when we declare onClick listener, when we say implements, we're going application wide and saying, let's give us a single onClick listener for all the views that we want to implement onClick listener for. And because we're passing in the onClick listener right here instead of declaring it as new onClick listener right here. You can do it this way, but it's really annoying because you have to declare the entire method every single time rather than just having one method and one switch statement, right? I can show you what the alternative to this is, just in case you don't want to do this whole thing or don't want to put a bunch of implements right here. But this would look like this. We'd say onClick listener, and then this same onClick thing would be right here. But since we have only one view implementing this specific onClick listener, we don't have to do this whole if statement or this switch statement right here. We can just say, like, obviously the mess where the add button was just clicked. Here, I'll make this bigger because you might not be able to see it. But I removed the implements right here, and I just said new onClick listener. So I literally, Android does all this autofill for you. So onClick listener, enter, and we get this entire thing right here. And we're getting a bunch of errors because I think it's because I don't have this implemented. Yeah, but that's one alternative. You can do it this way, you can do it this way. I liked it this way because we just had a bunch of buttons, but yeah, feel free to do it this way. Same behavior, just no need for a switch statement. Any other questions?
Let's see, do we have any other questions for Fedor? If you have any other questions, feel free to post them in the YouTube chat right now. Otherwise, one person did challenge you to do the entire thing without using division or modulus.
Oh no, I'm not going to do that. That's
Yeah.
Mod's my favorite operator. I'm going to use it for all my interview questions that have to do with FizzBuzz.
So if you have any other questions after this is over, you can feel free to talk to people on the student R&D chat. It's chat.srnd.org if you have attended a code day or anything else. And in fact, Fedor is on there from time to time. So from time to time, you can ask him there. Fedor, do you have a Twitter, any other social media you want to plug for people to follow you on?
I don't really. I'm not on any social media that often. What's my Twitter handle? Only Russian, I think. It's like only_Russian, just because I'm Russian, and I like to make fun of that sometimes. You can hit me up there. You can hit me up at my first and last name at yahoo.com. I'm pretty fast at responding, or at Fedor on the Slack channel, just at FEDOR.
Cool. Thank you so much for your time.
Yep.